My name is Callie Wright, and this is the Gaytheist Manifesto. This last weekend, I was in Los Angeles for PatreCon. It's a conference for folks who make stuff on Patreon. It was an amazing time. I got real FaceTime with some of the folks who work there, and they really do seem passionate about helping folks who make stuff get paid for their art. It was a pretty amazing environment to be in. I've not really gotten close to the point of burnout, but lately I've definitely been feeling the weight of the show's subject material. It's a dark time to be queer or trans in the United States right now, and that weighs on me. To be in a space with other creative folks who are just as passionate as I am was literally life-giving. I met other queer and trans creators, made some connections, had some really great conversation, and made some really cool plans for the future. I can't say more than that for now, but there's some exciting stuff in store. And I also want to give a shout out to Nikki, who's our newest patron this week. Her and I actually met at PatreCon and had a really great talk about self-care and activism. This show would not be possible in its current form without the folks who support us on Patreon. So if you want to help me keep telling these stories, check out patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto and consider a pledge. Thank you, friends. Love you lots. Quick note before we get started, this episode contains lots of discussion of transphobic rhetoric and references to eating disorders and self-harm. As always, please take care of yourselves, friends. When I came out, I had a strategy. The idea was to start close and sort of widen the circle. I told those closest to me and most likely to support me first, and I told them in person. And I slowly widened that circle of in-person conversations. And over the course of dinner and movie dates and eventually phone conversations and text messages, the circle got wider. I was really lucky. My friends and most of my family were almost universally supportive. And aside from expressing their love and support, there was one sentiment I heard over and over again. People were surprised. I wore the man suit well. I checked most of the man stereotype boxes. I had a giant manly beard, I was in a metal band, wore band t-shirts, gym shorts, lack of personal hygiene, and so on. The closet metaphor exists for a reason. From a young age, we're taught that being different in the way we're different is not okay. It's both explicit and implicit. Even if we don't have the vocabulary, it's something most of us just know. The closet is dark and it's scary, but sometimes it's safer than the alternative. Some of us have to very carefully curate our personal lives and interactions with others to erase every outward hint of our queerness or our transness. It's a self-defense and survival mechanism. That being the case, I feel like it's safe to say that everyone's coming out is going to be a surprise to at least some of the folks in their lives. And this week, we're going to talk about a study and a group of people who have apparently forgotten altogether that this is a thing. I was scrolling through Twitter a few weeks ago and ran across an article from some shitty conservative news rag I'm not going to name because they don't need the clicks. The title made my stomach turn. Is transgender the new anorexia? New study suggests so. What the fuck? This new study is called Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria in Adolescents and Young Adults, a study of parental reports. Let's see, rapid onset gender dysphoria. Certainly sounds science-y, right? And there's a study about it. Seems legit. So what is it?
This is a concept created by a cluster of trans-exclusionary radical feminist sites in mid-2016.
Oh.
These sites were Youth Trans-Critical Professionals, Fourth Wave Now, and Transgender Trend.
This is Zinnia Jones. She's a researcher, writer, activist, and the creator of Gender Analysis, which is a fantastic blog about trans stuff, by the way.
They proposed this as a rapid onset or sudden onset of gender dysphoria occurring mostly in teenagers, mostly in those who are assigned female, although certainly not limited to that by any means, who were apparently influenced by their friends or by reading things on the internet to believe that they had gender dysphoria. It almost feels ridiculous just to say it, but that's what it is.
Yes, we must find anything we can to explain away our kids' transness or gender dysphoria. It's the internet. It's those other kids whose parents didn't raise them right. It's Satan. It's like the satanic panic, but for gender.
And this underwent a kind of scientific laundering, I'll say, because these three sites, were used as recruitment sites for this study being proposed by Dr. Lisa Littman, who is an assistant professor at Brown University. And using a SurveyMonkey and anonymous respondents, she ran a survey regarding items and measures that she felt would be relevant to this supposed condition of youth being afflicted by gender dysphoria that they caught from the internet or from their friends.
The study was published in full in the journal PLOS 1 on August 16, 2018. The study's purported purpose is as follows. In online forums, parents have been reporting that their children are experiencing what is described here as rapid onset gender dysphoria, appearing for the first time during puberty or even after its completion. The onset of gender dysphoria seemed to occur in the context of belonging to a peer group where one, multiple, or even all of the friends have become gender dysphoric and transgender identified during the same time frame. Parents also report that their children exhibited an increase in social media/internet use prior to disclosure of a transgender identity. The purpose of this study was to document and explore these observations and describe the resulting presentation of gender dysphoria, which is inconsistent with existing research literature. So she collected her data by posting a SurveyMonkey link on forums of websites like the aforementioned Transgender Trend, Fourth Wave Now, and Youth Transcritical Professionals. You do see the problem starting to develop, yes? These were questions asked on explicitly and virulently anti-trans websites, and the respondents were not the trans kids themselves, but their anti-trans parents. It's absolutely brilliant.
It introduces a major sampling bias. This was a very low quality study. That's the nicest thing you could say about it, is that it's a very low quality study. It takes what these parents believe their children to be experiencing without evaluating these children at all, and then concluding that they have this wholly unproven new condition without ever having examined them clinically or anything of the sort. And the idea that this would generate accurate data to work with here, let alone to base claiming that there is an entirely new form of gender dysphoria taking place here, is really quite ludicrous. When you look at these three sites that respondents were collected from, there is absolutely no doubt that this is an incredibly biased sample in every sense of the word. These are communities of people who believe that transgender youth are the result of some kind of medical conspiracy, or that all transgender youth are just mistaken about being transgender or don't really have gender dysphoria, or it's caused by something else that can be treated in other ways. And it's really just this superstructure of denialism. It's as if they've selectively forgotten that the closet is a thing and that trans and queer youth have every reason to be immensely secretive when it comes to family members who may be unsupportive or even dangerous. Trans youth are having a lot of identity development over a period of years happening behind the scenes before anyone else in their lives find out about it. So the very phrase rapid onset gender dysphoria relies on the argument that this onset is rapid. And based on the data, the data is not sufficient to conclude that at all. It's not high enough quality in any way or representative enough at all to say that the onset of their gender dysphoria was certainly rapid, based only on a parent's perception of what their child expresses outwardly. And that really goes to the core of it. And this also applies to what they've said is a social contagion, a socially contagious factor in this rapid onset gender dysphoria, saying that when one of these kids comes out as trans, then some of their friends also come out as trans. And they think, oh, that must mean it's spreading, rather than, oh, people who are similar to one another will flock together and you can learn things from one another and become aware of things together. The paper equivocates between becoming gender dysphoric, her words, and becoming transgender identified. So this relies not only on parents' perceptions of when they thought their kids were gender dysphoric, even if they hadn't come out yet, but it also relies on parents' reports of perceiving this in other people's children, which is very far-fetched. And just accurately being able to tell when other people's children just became gender dysphoric. It's a real irony that in the paper she goes on to decry specialist evaluation by expert gender clinicians as being somehow inadequate here, and yet this is a reliable source of information because parents are somehow all-knowing in this regard. Nothing supports that assumption.
And so obviously there's an ideological bent here, right? There's the veneer of science, there's sciencey language, and there's fancy sounding words, but it's really just about transphobia.
One of the spokespeople of one of these sites, she said that transitioning is, quote, enslaving. She also called transitioning physician-assisted self-harm. And they just really run the gamut of everything that is textbook transphobic rhetoric. If you look at the people who are doing the most promoting of this particular study, you'll find that this is something that is largely cheered by far-right conservative groups. You see people like Robert Stacey McCain, who was too racist for Twitter somehow and actually got banned, chiming in about how this terrible epidemic of rapid onset gender dysphoria is happening, and the Federalist and the Alliance Defending Freedom, the right-wing group that is literally suing schools to keep trans kids out of bathrooms and locker rooms. Those are the people who are most promoting this as a concept, as some kind of contagion afflicting youth. And it doesn't take any real leap of imagination to see that these are the very same characters that opposed gay rights for decades and decades, made the same arguments for decades and decades, treated queer people as contagious or a public health risk or a danger to kids or anything like that. This is just recycled. This is completely recycled, and it's really striking how many people don't seem to see this. And it's like, can we just skip it this time? There's nothing new here.
And the author of the study has responded to some of this criticism.
She has said that it's just a descriptive study, but that really does not account for it still being conducted so poorly in so many ways. She said that she is working on or would like to do a follow-up study that includes some of these youth who allegedly have this condition as well as their parents. I can't even imagine how that is going to turn out. And that is basically her response to all of this. She insists that it has some value as an initial descriptive study, and I don't, because it overreaches in claiming that there is a new condition here based on just flawed arguments and low quality data. And that can be really irresponsible, particularly given how willing they are to use this to invalidate these children's genders for any reason whatsoever, any excuse. And that deserves to be looked at critically when that is what's at stake. In the paper, she explicitly does compare this supposed rapid onset gender dysphoria to anorexia and pro-ana content in its supposedly socially contagious nature and potential influence from friend groups and from online sources. And this is a really disturbing implication, really, because think about policies handling pro-ana, thinspo content, all of that. You would literally, that implies that you would literally be treating information about gender dysphoria, about trans people, any of the facts regarding that, as if they are some kind of dangerous pro-ana content that needs to be subject to close regulation. And that is absurd. That, more than anything else, makes it clear how absurd that analogy to anorexia would be. Are they really going to treat published papers about the known medical benefits of transitioning as if this was like the same as spreading graphic self-harm imagery on Facebook or Instagram? And all I see here, when Littman's paper specifically quoted one of my articles as a possible contributing factor to this new condition, and then went on to describe this online material as potentially analogous to pro-Ana content, and that it should be studied as such, I see that as an ideologically motivated activist looking to censor science.
And so, to put it nicely, this study has problems. Not just in the technical pieces of its bad setup, bad execution, and gigantic leaps in logic, but in the consequences it has in validating anti-trans sentiments aimed specifically at kids, who are obviously some of the most vulnerable members of our society, which leads one to reasonably wonder how this shit got published in the first place.
PLOS1 has a publishing model that's pretty distinct from what you might imagine goes on at most other scientific journals and their process of peer review. PLOS1, as they say, they want to accelerate the publication of science, which seems to imply just stripping away any part of that process that they feel is extraneous. And that's largely their approach. They point out that they only review these papers for technical concerns and so on. They don't so much review the subjective underlying arguments made in it or anything of that sort. It's a much more limited kind of review that will just go over whether things are just technically correct in the most technical sense and may not necessarily catch underlying issues that require, say, a more detailed knowledge of the subject matter being discussed. Like, as they say, this pre-publication peer review will concentrate on technical rather than subjective concerns. And they also do note that their model is intended to instead have a sort of community peer review happen after the fact once the papers are published.
Now, I'm not an academic, so I can't really comment on the wisdom of this publishing model, but if we put this study in that context, I mean, okay, I guess. On August 27th, after reviewing criticism of the study, PLOS1 issued a statement. PLOS1 is aware of the reader concerns raised on the study's content and methodology. We take all concerns raised about publications in the journal very seriously and are following up on these per our policy and COPE guidelines. As part of our follow-up, we will seek further expert assessment on the study's methodology and analyses. We will provide a further update once we have completed our assessment and discussions. Now, this was followed by Brown University, the college the study's author works at, removing the press release from their website about the study, and transphobes proceeded to utterly lose their shit. And this situation is absolutely a godsend for these folks, right? They get a study, however flawed, that confirms what they already believe about the reality of being trans. They get affirmed in their bigotry, then the research gets put under review, because of course it does, because it's fucking terrible. And now they have a victim narrative, right? It's a very tidy arrangement, and it's one that's very difficult to combat.
This is a situation tailor-made for exactly these kinds of free speech grifters, as they've been called. This is something I've attempted to address before. I had put up an article earlier this month about how an op-ed writer from the Wall Street Journal had contacted me for my comment on this, and I explained at length the serious scientific flaws with the study in almost every respect, and how this personally involves me, and how this is just very bad science. And then what ends up being published in her Wall Street Journal op-ed is just this invective, just decrying trans people as ideologues, as some censorious group who is suppressing important, legitimate science. That it's amazing how that got twisted around. I had tried to talk to Jeffrey Flyer, who wrote an article in Quillette. He's a former dean of Harvard Medical School, I believe. And he had written an article on Quillette depicting a tweet from a fellow trans woman on Twitter to the journal PLOS1 that published Littman's study. And he had concluded, therefore, from this one snippet of one conversation and two tweets, that this journal somehow put this paper under review after the fact because of overwhelming pressure from transgender activists. And in doing that, he had to scroll right past my own tweet that was adjacent in that thread, pointing out the scientific flaws of it to PLOS1. And that was strangely omitted in his narrative. He just wanted a picture of irrational activists who are ideologically motivated suppressing science. He didn't want a picture of other people who are well versed in the science engaging with the science and offering substantive criticism of that science. I don't think they seem to realize how unusual it is for a paper to, after it's been published in a journal, for the journal to publicly announce that it's been put under review again. I don't think they understand how uncommon it is for a university to withdraw a press release about a study by one of its own professors, which is really the remarkable part of all this. This journal itself that she published in solicits exactly this kind of feedback after papers are published. This is the scientific process working as it should. Peer review does not end once a paper is published by any means. The journal she published in explicitly says otherwise. So then to have that engagement with the science that I've published at length. I've published tens of thousands of words over the past couple of months dealing with this specific paper and its arguments. That is somehow just dismissed as not being a valid part of this in some sense. That's absolutely ludicrous.
And so the obvious question now is, how do we fight this? Because we have a group of people who clearly are not interested in engaging with the actual science. They have an anti-trans axe to grind and are not going to be convinced by any science, any argument, or any appeal to trans people's actual humanity. That's a big fucking hill to climb.
The people you're trying to convince are the ones that you don't see. Not the most vociferous opponents, but the people on the sidelines who haven't made up their minds yet and might be swayed either way potentially. We contribute to that. What I can say is that people need to speak out about this, blog about this, vlog about this, just apply whatever particular set of skills that you have to looking at it critically and analyzing it. If you have experience or expertise in areas like scientific methods and experimental design, statistics, anything like that, any knowledge of transgender history and literature, anything you can bring to bear on that, personal stories of just how your gender dysphoria developed and your experiences with family and how they reacted to that and how that comes to bear on this kind of thing, or just share anything else that someone is writing about it, because this has received a lot of coverage from so many trans people in the community lately. If you have connections to any outlets where you could publish something about this, go for it. There was an article about my critique of this study in Slate earlier this month, and that was really good to see that this was getting some coverage. And so whatever resources you have at hand and whatever you feel you can contribute in terms of your take on this, that's really just what we have to keep doing, because whatever the effect may be, it can only be a good one, and this is something that we want to have part of the record of how this science has been engaged with and critiqued in the public sphere. We want to be part of that.
So how will you be a part of it? How will you engage? As always, I ask you to consider your skills, talents, and capacity to engage and get out and do the fucking thing, whatever that means to you. If you want to talk about it, I'm always here. You can get me on Twitter and Instagram at CallieGetsIt. The show is on Twitter at TheGaytheist. You can email me at podcast@thegaytheistmanifesto.com. Zinnia Jones is the creator of genderanalysis.net. It's a fantastic blog for trans stuff. Zinnia, we appreciate you. We love you. Thank you for diving down these rabbit holes so we don't have to. That, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of The Gaytheist Manifesto. If you think this story and others like it are important, please share it around to your friends. Our stories need to be told and they need to be heard. A little sharing goes a long way. You can also check out patreon.com/thegaytheistmanifesto. The show would not be what it is without the folks who give there. I love you and thank you. Before I go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things, and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.